back to database management. In this module, we will talk about database triggers. We will talk about what the advantages and disadvantages of using triggers are, and we will look at how a trigger is built, how to test it, and how to use it for simple table update auditing purposes. And now let's take a look at triggers. Let's first look at triggers in general. Now, SQL triggers are a great way to check for the integrity of data. We can run them on schedule or we can run them on demand, and that's the more frequent way of doing that, based on whether data is being inserted, updated, or deleted from a table. We can then specify whether we want these triggers to run before or after a change is made to the data in tables. Now, this makes triggers very useful for auditing purposes. Some of the disadvantages of triggers are that when they run, that increases the overhead of the database server, but the functionality is not as broad as that of stored procedures. Triggers are typically limited to operations on tables, namely inserts, updates, and deletes, but it is also possible to call stored procedures from triggers. While the syntax of triggers is not that different from the syntax of stored procedures, there's an added component, and that is what I like to call the fire point of the trigger. That is when the trigger is being activated. That is typically upon an insert or update or a delete on a table. Typically, MySQL allows you up to 6 triggers on a table. That may change as MySQL versions change as well. So triggers can be affixed to tables before or after inserts, before or after updates, and before or after deletes. And there's a specific naming convention to a trigger. We name a trigger based on whether it fires before or after a change is made to the table, followed by the name of the table which the trigger monitors, and then the action on the table that the trigger monitors, whether it's an insert or update or a delete. So for example here, after, so the trigger fires after an insert is being made into the table called movie rental. Triggers are often used to audit changes. In order to do that, we need 3 things. Number 1, the table to monitor. For us, that's going to be the person table in the movie stream database. Secondly, we need a table in which to store the log of the changes to that table that we're monitoring. For us, that is going to be a new table that we're creating called Person Audit. This is the create code here, and this is what the table looks like once it's been created. Lastly, we need the trigger itself, about which we'll talk in a moment. And notice that the delimiter is being reset at the beginning of the trigger creation code. So it's very important afterwards to reset the delimiter again. So what does a trigger actually look like? Well, a trigger and a stored procedure have a number of elements in common, but a trigger actually contains some more because we have to identify when the trigger is supposed to fire. Let's take a look here. As with a stored procedure, a trigger always starts with a resetting of the delimiter because we are indicating to MySQL that in what follows there will be at least one or more SQL statements that are delimited with the regular semicolon, and they will form a code block. So the next row then is the create statement, where we're creating the trigger, and then the name of the trigger. Note the naming convention here, the fire point before or after, the table that's being monitored, here in our case person, and then the action based on which the trigger is being fired, namely update. In the next row, we specify when exactly the trigger is supposed to fire. That's before or after whichever action on the table. The action here is update, and our table name is person. And then we specify whether we want to batch process or process for each row. So for each row that's being updated. In our case, that's what we're doing. And then you're already seeing a keyword that you already know from a stored procedure, namely begin. And of course, where there is a begin, there must be an end. And look here, the end also contains the use of the reset delimiter in order to indicate the end of the code block. And then we have our SQL statements. Here, SQL statements contain a very interesting way of referencing the time-bound information that we have in our person table, namely old and new. Old is information before the action or before the change has taken place, and new is the information after the change, namely here the update, has taken place. So here we are saying we are storing the person ID as the old person ID. That is, we're backing up the old information before the update. And we're doing the same thing with the family name here as the old family name, the old middle name, and the old given name. That is all the information before the update process has been successful. And then we're also going to store the timestamp on which the information was changed, and we're going to use the now function in order to do that. Always remember, at the end of any stored procedure, trigger, or function that you write, if you reset the delimiter at the beginning and use it at the end, you will have to set it back to the semicolon later. Here's what this trigger looks like in MySQL Workbench. We're seeing here the person table, we're seeing the person audit table, that is the logging table, and we are seeing our trigger, which is part of the information and the actions that belong to the person table. So this is not a global trigger, very much unlike a stored procedure, but the trigger here, as we can see, is very specific to this table because it monitors this table. So how do you test a trigger? Well, you perform the action on the table that it is monitoring. Remember that our trigger monitors changes to the person table and backs up the pre-change information, the old information, in the person audit table. Now we are going to update the person table. We're going to set the death date, which is a change, to a value for a person with a person ID number 9. If our trigger works correctly, our trigger will then fire and will insert the old information for that person into our person audit table. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to select everything from the person audit table, and we should see information for our person with a person ID number 9. And in fact, as we're seeing here, our change number 1 is made on the record of person ID number 9, and here we're seeing the old information for Miss Virginia Baker. And we're also seeing here a date, which is our change date. This is in fact not just the date, this is the timestamp, the output of the now function that our update has triggered. Let's do another one. Here we're updating the person table again, and we're going to set the person family name to Goldberg, where our person ID is number 10. So we should see a second entry now in our person audit table with the old information for this person with the person ID number 10. Now let's take a look at the person audit table.
And what we're seeing here is, oh yeah, we have a change number 2 here. And that change happened for person ID number 10, just as we had made up here. And what we're seeing as the person family name is not Goldberg, because Goldberg is the new name. Instead, we see here Bernstein. Bernstein is the old name for Mr. Gerald Bernstein. And again, here we are seeing our timestamp, which is the timestamp at which this update was made, and the type of action was indeed an update. So when we test our triggers, the first thing we do is we write to our audit log, and then we test by searching our audit log for the update. And we again write and we test.
So to summarize, we have looked at the advantages and disadvantages of using triggers, and we have looked at how triggers are built. Then we have tested and used a simple audit trigger. Great job! Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in another video.